All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, folks, for joining. I see we have a good group of folks that are coming in the door right now. And really, really excited for this webinar. Today, my name is Chris Neidl, by the way. I'm one of the co-founders of the OpenAir Collective. And I am also a policy consultant for the Natural Resources Defense Council, working on state-level industrial decarbonization policies, which is relevant to today's discussion. And what we're going to do today is really, those of you who are part of the OpenAir community or part of the league or NRDC or advocates in this space are probably familiar with the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, or LECCLA, which is a piece of legislation that was just signed into law a little over a week ago by Governor Murphy in New Jersey. And today's not going to be a real discussion of the policy and what the policy does. I think that there's a lot that we can provide in links and has been covered on previous programs. What we want to do right now is have sort of a retrospective on the story of it, how it was from an advocacy view. LECCLA became a piece of legislation, where the policy came from, and all of the different things that had to have happened over the last couple of years to finally make it law. All those twists and turns, and for that, I'm really, really excited to have a panel of three folks who I'll introduce in just a moment, who are really critical to that story and can tell it better than anybody else. So today is a conversation about that, and this will be very, very conversational. What I'll ask folks to do is, if you have questions or comments or anything like that, this is really, you're part of the conversation. And if you could drop that in the Q&A panel, I'll be looking at that as we go and just folding questions in. So there's not going to be like the last 15 minutes or Q&A. We're just going to have you part of the conversation as we go. So what I'll do to go ahead and start off, though, is I do want to just give a little bit of a background on the bill, just so you do know what we're talking about if you're not familiar with it, just to sort of give you a grounding in that. And then I'll introduce our discussants today, and we'll go ahead and start the conversation. So LECCLA. So this is a kind of a special bill in the history of OpenAir. Again, I provided some links there to OpenAir if you're not familiar with it. We're an all-volunteer, now increasingly global network of advocates and citizen scientists and makers that are focused on advancing carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions. And the reason why LECCLA is special within an open air context is this is the very first bill that we as a community came up with. That's one of the things that OpenAir does, is we research, develop, and then write our own legislation and then try to get it introduced. And so this was the very first bill that I think technically it really kind of started at the end of 2019, but really got going initially in New York in 2020. And I was lucky to have worked on that campaign. And then one of the things we aspire to in OpenAir is what we call viral policy. And this was the sort of first instance of that, is that if we get a policy introduced in one particular place through our membership and our partners, how can we adapt that policy and then see it spread elsewhere? And so definitely LECCLA is the most viral of our policies so far. There's versions of it that have been introduced in Massachusetts, Virginia, as well as Illinois. And a version of this bill did pass last year in New York. It's a bit different, as we'll discuss, than the New Jersey one, as well as a sort of a much lighter version of it also passed in Virginia last year. So this is definitely a viral policy, and we hope to see it, now that we have one version of it, a great version of it, the best version of it is a law in New Jersey, see that spread all over the place. So we'll talk about that at the end of the call, about how we might be able to make that happen. So the other thing about LECCLA, again, as I said, is it kind of gave us a framework for, well, how do you get a small group of passionate advocates together to learn and create policy and then get it introduced? So within OpenAir, this kind of created the template for other pieces of legislation that have now been introduced in other places that do different things related to carbon dioxide removal in New York and Massachusetts and California, New York City, and over in Europe, we have a great bill in Luxembourg, and many more in development, both in the United States and Europe, and hopefully soon elsewhere. So this was really important to sort of our origin story, and remains a really important part of OpenAir's origin story. And so just a little bit of background. What is LECCLA? We got introduced in LECCLA or interested in this area of policy related to concrete, because concrete is an incredibly common material. It's the second most used material on Earth after water. We produce upwards of 50 billion tons of it globally per year. And it's very, very carbon intensive because of one of its principal ingredients, cement, which accounts for about 7 or 8% of all global emissions. And so we're interested in it as CDR advocates because there are new and emerging technologies that are now already commercialized that allows you to store carbon that can be taken from the air or from industrial sources in concrete. So we see that as an important pathway for carbon dioxide removal. So that was what initiated our interest. And the couple of the terms that are right there in the bill, when we talk about emissions from concrete, we're really talking about what we call embodied carbon emissions. So unlike operational carbon emissions, which are the emissions that are produced from using something like your car or your lights or what have you, embodied carbon are the emissions that are associated with the production or making of something. And so when we talk about concrete, we're really talking about embodied carbon. And lower embodied carbon concrete or low embodied carbon concrete can be achieved in many different ways. And this is just a measure, a term that we use that describes any forms of concrete and its many diverse forms that are lower in concrete because of methods or materials than what is standard or sort of the prevailing types of mixes or designs that are normally used. So that's the LEC part of LECCLA. And so what LECCLA is, and many of the open air bills are, they're focused on how the public sector, states or national governments or even cities can use their procurement power. They buy a lot of stuff in order to help create markets and sort of drive low carbon concrete or more broadly carbon dioxide removal technology. So a lot of the different bills that we work on fall, broadly speaking, within the public procurement bucket. And in the case of LECCLA and concrete, in most places, when you're talking about states, and this is somewhat unique when you look across different areas of decarbonization, the public sector actually is a major purchaser of concrete. And we know that because of infrastructure and bridges and sidewalks and roads and buildings and universities, et cetera. That really adds up. It's just, I think, under 40% of all concrete purchased in the US is from various levels of the public sector. And usually in any given state, if you look at all the different state agencies added together, they tend to be right there at the top of the list in terms of the largest aggregate purchasers of concrete. And that's certainly the case in New Jersey. And so what that means is that states like New Jersey or other places or any public sector level, federal or municipal, can play a really, really important role in being the early adopters of new forms of concrete or existing forms of concrete that have lower carbon than what is the norm. So there's a real important role for them to come in, be early adopters, help catalyze or shape markets for new ways of making concrete and using it. And they also play a really, really important role in terms of the standards and specifications around what can legally be used in terms of mixes for concrete. So the state plays a really pivotal role in sort of shaping the future of concrete. So that's why we focus on it. And so the way that this bill actually works, I'm just going to give it the most simple definition of it. And when I get a hand free, I'll post the bill and some other materials in the chat. But the way that LECCLA works and is somewhat unique about it is that now the state of New Jersey will come in and kind of create a threshold or a baseline for how much embodied carbon can be in the concrete that it purchases. And that can be measured using a metric called global warming potential. It's literally a measurement of how many, I believe, pounds of CO2 are produced from a kilogram of carbon, I believe is the measurement. And the way that these are measured and reported out are through a common tool that is the sort of the dominant kind of tool for reporting on global warming potential as well as other environmental impacts called an EPD or an environmental product declaration. And the way that this works in practice is it's an incentive mechanism that encourages concrete producers who are doing work with the state, who have to deliver concrete for state projects, is that it encourages them to to maximize how much carbon they can squeeze out of their concrete and giving them a financial incentive for it. So the way that it works is, let's say you have Acme Concrete somewhere in New Jersey is delivering concrete for a bridge project somewhere in the state. If they're able to go ahead and submit an EPD that has their global warming potential number on it, and if that global warming potential number is below that threshold that the state has set, they're eligible for basically a performance-based tax credit of up to 5% of whatever the value of that order is. So it gives them basically direct financial incentive in order to beat that baseline. And 5% might not sound like a lot, but in an industry like concrete that is the commodity of commodities, where the profit margins are razor thin. When you're talking about a 5% bump, that's low cost for the taxpayer, but very, very significant for participants in this industry. And one of the things, and this goes back to the very earliest days of LECCLA that is tied to our interest in the subject as CDR advocates, there's an additional incentive of up to 3%, which is compounded with that 5 for concretes that actually mixes that take carbon either out of the air or from industrial sources and store it in concrete. So this is creating an additional incentive for these emerging and now commercial technologies. So again, there's a lot more detail and some of it might come up, but just want to give you a baseline understanding of what this policy does. And now what we'll do is we'll get right into the main event. If I can get my thing to move forward, I might be having some difficulty with that. Well, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and stop sharing and I'll just say it. We're going to talk about the story of how this passed in New Jersey. And with me, I have, and guests, please feel free to turn on your cameras and your microphones, and we'll get right into the conversation. So we have 3 of the principal figures that have been involved in this effort that, again, spans at least 2 years, over 2 years now, I think. And I'm just going to introduce them, and then we'll go ahead and start a conversation. And again, I want to just remind people, if you have questions or anything you want to kind of add, go ahead and add it in the chat, and I'm going to be looking at that, and I'll incorporate your questions and observations as we go. So I'm going to start with Sue Dorward, who is the chief kind of architect behind this effort. We'll talk about how that became so, who's an advocate for open air in New Jersey. And Sue works as a sustainability and energy coordinator at Raritan Valley Community College, which has installed 2 low carbon concrete projects and was an early supporter as an institution of New Jersey LECCLA. She is a member of OpenAir Collective and is currently pursuing her master's of carbon management at Columbia University. We also have Allison McLeod, who is the public policy director at the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. Allison directs the organization's lobbying efforts and campaign plans and works to build relationships with legislative and administrative officials, which she did very ably during the LECCLA campaign. And she also plays a lead role in managing the organization's programs and coalitions. And last but not least, we have my colleague at NRDC, Eric Miller, who works to advance clean energy policy in New Jersey. His current areas of focus include energy efficiency and conservation, transportation, and renewable energy initiatives. And prior to joining NRDC, Eric served as the policy counsel for the Keystone Energy Efficiency Alliance, where he worked on energy efficiency and utility business model reform policies in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So thank you all for joining. Really, really excited to chat with you all.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Chris.
Great. When you guys get a free hand, go ahead and please, if you haven't already, just drop in your relevant Twitter links and anything that is about you. Please do share it in the chat. Would be great. So great. Well, let's get right into it. I want to really kind of take a historical approach here, at least at the beginning, and kind of talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, the bill's origins are right next door in New York. That was a campaign that I worked on and continue to work on because that story is not over. But then it spread to New Jersey, and that didn't just happen automatically like the flu. It involved a key person here. And I want to ask Sue, if you can tell us a little bit about that moment where we had the very first instance of viral policy in open air, and you were the person who did that.
Yeah, so it was really my first deep dive into doing advocacy. I mean, I didn't come into this with experience trying to pass any bills, but I was on the air miners community, and someone from there pointed me over to Open Air, and I heard about their bill in New York and talked to Chris about it. And I had an upcoming meeting. The college where I work is a member of a sustainable business committee at our local Chamber of Commerce. And we were having a meeting where the guest speaker was our local Assemblyman Zwicker in New Jersey. And I thought, well, it would be an opportunity to mention this bill to him and see if he'd be interested. So at the end of, he took questions at the end, and I said, hey, there's this bill in New York. Would you be interested? And he said, yes. And it turns out he's on the Science and Innovation, or he was on the Science, Science and Technology Committee. And so he sort of felt like it was in his purview. And that was the beginning. And it was really like this grassroots, this great story of, he was at a local sustainable business meeting, and one of his constituents reached out to him, and given that the bill was already going in New York, we were like, oh yeah, we'll just, borrow all of that language, and it went through the OLS, whatever, it's the Office of Legislative Services, and it went very quickly and started going through committees. And yeah, it was really great. And Chris gave a lot of support about, putting together a spreadsheet for your legislative contacts and building an open air committee of volunteers from New Jersey. And so that was sort of a slow growing thing, but we just all reached out to our representatives and then cold called other representatives to get co-sponsors. And, we slowly built up a group of co-sponsors, maybe 5 co-sponsors. And we also called up environmental groups, like the Environmental Defense Fund and the U.S. Green Building Council, and then of course our NRDC and New Jersey League of Conservation Voters and other groups, getting them on board with the bill. And over time, we built up this list, and the small businesses from my little committee, they all jumped on board, and it was all very exciting. We have Solidia in New Jersey, which is a big low carbon concrete company. So we built this list of supporting organizations over time, and it was very grassroots. And then what happened was it passed the assembly. It had to go through 2 committees, and it passed in the assembly. We weren't getting any traction in the Senate because I think what happened was there was another bill, we call it the paver bill. It was a low carbon concrete bill, but it was just for precast. And that was going through, and I think what happened, and it's not anything official that I know, but I think the senator involved in that bill kind of put a hold on our bill so that nobody could sponsor it. And finally, when that bill passed, then someone was able to sponsor in the Senate. So Senator Greenstein did that. But at that point, it had passed in the assembly. And so then the business groups started paying attention. And we kind of entered this second phase where there were some objections. The contractors didn't want anyone to touch the the bidding process. So originally the bill was all about a bidding preference as opposed to a tax incentive. So they said, oh, well, if it was just a tax incentive, then we'd support it. So we're like, okay, let's switch it to be a tax incentive. And so we had some revisions to the bill that went through the Senate committees. And then we said, okay, what about the governor's office? Let's make sure they're on board. Well, it turns out because there's action required by the state to set these benchmarks and to review the incoming requests for tax credit, they had some concerns and it needed some additional revisions. And we didn't have time before the end of the session to get those revisions done, unfortunately. So we had to go through a second session and do another round of revisions. And because of the players involved and involving the legislators more intensively in the amendments and involving the governor's office and the industry players, it became more than just an easy grassroots copy from New York. It became, it was great to have Allison from League of Conservation Voters and Eric sort of lobbying for the bill. And we also had an industry lobbyist who had worked on the paver bill, who knew all the players because he had dealt with the same objections. And they really ran with it and, spent a lot of time working with the senator and negotiating the amendments and getting a lot of support. So, and I forgot to mention, League of Conservation Voters also hosted a webinar with the Assemblyman Zwicker and with Dr. Matt Adams, who is a concrete specialist at New Jersey Institute of Technology. So they really helped kick it off. But maybe they can speak more about the later stages.
Yeah, and that is somebody who witnessed it and was sometimes a participant. That is a very condensed history. Thanks, Sue. That really spread out over 2 years. And we'll get into some of the sort of the twists and turns that you just summarized for us as we get into the conversation. But a couple things to just really highlight there that I think are really really important for people who are listening. You've been a lifelong environmentalist, and I could say that Sue is one of the sharpest, quickest learners that I know, but you didn't really have a background in advocacy. And you kind of quickly summarized it, but I think taking that first big leap into embracing something like this, and we'll talk about some of the other folks in OpenAir who worked on this, and then showing up and posing that question to Assembly Member Zwicker, that takes a lot of getting out of your comfort zone, I guess. And before I sort of invite Allison and Eric in to kind of talk about what brought them into this campaign, I wonder if you can just zoom in on that moment a little bit, Sue, and what was that like to kind of take something like this on and to take that first step to engage who ultimately became our sponsor?
Well, what made it easier for me was Chris's support in doing this. I mean, I knew he had the bill in New York. I wasn't just trying to do something out of thin air. And so I felt more secure, that it was out there, kind of been vetted by other politicians as something that was doable. And then just having the backing of OpenAir to, give guidance, for Chris to give guidance. He was really great. But also to have other people from OpenAir ready to step in and say, hey, I live in New Jersey. I could talk to my representative, and we would have weekly meetings to talk about what we were up to and what we needed. And, it was a nice little group, and it wasn't scary.
Yeah, we'll talk about
even though it was all new to me. I sort of felt like, everyone was, at least early on, there was a lot of support and not a lot of contention. So it was kind of an easy entry.
Yeah, we'll talk about that group in a minute because they're a key cast of characters, and it was amazing to see that happen. I also want to say that I was pleased to give a lot of guidance, but through this process, this is the most substantial legislative win that OpenAir has had, that we learned a lot about how to run these kinds of volunteer-based campaigns that we're now paying forward into other campaigns. So, it continues to evolve, and this was a major, punctuated moment in our evolution. So let's bring in Allison and Eric. I really want to absolutely stress how key Allison and Eric's involvement in this campaign were. They just incredible expertise and connections and commitment that they brought. So I wonder, just starting with Allison, if you could just talk a little bit about what is it that why was this something that so quickly the league really kind of got behind and prioritized? If you could tell us a little bit about your own journey into the campaign.
Absolutely. Would love to. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Sue. So I'm the policy director for an organization called the League of Conservation Voters. We do have a national organization and branches in other states, but here in New Jersey, we say we're the statewide political voice for the environment. So we're a 501c3 and C4, which means that we do legislative work and lobbying for environmental causes. And so every legislative session, which in New Jersey is, you have 2 years per legislative session, we set what we call a common agenda for the environment. And we talk to a lot of our partners, we talk to other advocates in the clean energy and environmental space, and we say, what are the 5 things that we should make sure we get accomplished this legislative cycle? I'm sorry if you guys could hear my dog in the background. She's making a little noise back there. But so we set our 5 common agenda goals, and we really commit to them. And so low carbon concrete, we heard from our partners that this was something that we should focus on. And one of the reasons that we made it one of our common agenda items and really pushed for it is because in the emissions reduction space and in the global climate change space, people understand power generation. It makes sense to them. Okay, clean power, less carbon. People understand transportation. Diesel trucks emit fumes, clean electric vehicles don't, right? That's kind of easy to understand. It's a lot harder to talk about buildings. And it's harder to talk about the emissions from buildings because it's just not as intuitive, I'll say. So, but we know that, it's a big part, I think in New Jersey, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, I know you're the expert here, it's about 19% of total emissions is from residential and commercial buildings. And so we saw this as a way that really makes sense to start to reduce emissions from the building sector, which can be, the most challenging conversation to have. And so I really do commend Sue, and I just want to echo kind of what you said, Chris, for everyone on this call that, I work in this space all the time. So legislators are always hearing from me about, what we're working on. But when they hear from their constituents, they really do listen. It really does get their attention, and they pay attention because at the end of the day, they're working for all of you. So if you have something like this that you bring to your legislator, there's a great chance, that they'll take that meeting, they'll learn from you. And again, it wouldn't have happened if Sue didn't have that first conversation. And so that's kind of how we got into this space and got involved and prioritized.
Yeah, and I think a big moment for us was when we like to do webinars when we kind of introduce a campaign or a subject, and the league was, awesome to host that and bring in their network, which gave a lot of oxygen sort of right out of the gate, I think. And so much you brought up there that we could just go off into, and we will in the next couple of minutes. But I want to bring Eric in. I really want to also set up the fact that, I also work for NRDC as a consultant in New York and other states, and NRDC of the national groups has really embraced the not only industrial decarbonization, but particularly concrete in a big way, both on the federal level and on the state level, and are really kind of a prime mover of trying to spread model policy throughout the U.S. at the national and state and municipal level. I popped in a little guide to low carbon concrete procurement that I co-authored with Dr. Caleb Woodall that is worth a read. But Eric, right off the bat, when we kind of moved to New Jersey, you just had a wealth of sort of knowledge and expertise of what the landscape was like. So I wondered if you could tell a little bit about your story of engagement in this campaign.
Yeah, happy to do so. I'm very pleased to be here today. I was actually digging through my emails to try to get a sense of the timeline on this. And it is almost 2 years to the day, I think, since I got an email from our industrial decarbonization team introducing me to you, Chris, and then explaining the type of work that NRDC had been working on in several different states and also at the federal level on kind of the buy clean and industrial decarbonization front, which frankly was new to me. I'm primarily an energy policy person. So like Allison described, cars and the power sector is where I spend most of my time, but I do spend all of that time in New Jersey. And so I had an introductory call with Sue and with Chris, learned that now Senator, but then Assemblyman Zwicker had an interest in this piece of legislation and really hit the ground running. By that time, Sue had already built out quite a list of organizations who were interested in seeing this move forward. And previously, I had worked in a state that maybe is not as friendly to these types of policies. So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say, some of the environmental factors, not to use a pun about the environment, but in New Jersey that made it really right for this kind of activity is, number one, we have statutes and policies that support decarbonization of the economy. The Murphy administration, since coming in, has been really front and center on growing the clean economy in New Jersey and also decarbonizing the economy where we can. We are fortunate to have a legislature with a lot of individual environmental champions who, when they take up a cause, it's not just because, someone is telling them to, but because they believe in it, they want to be a part of it. We found that initially with Senator Zwicker and then later with Senator Greenstein. And I think we fell in very quickly to a rhythm of engagement pretty much on a weekly basis to stay on top of this and essentially do the work of policy formation and pushing legislation, which requires, again, very consistent on the ground presence, whether it's in committee meetings, meeting with legislators, keeping everyone on the same page. And I believe those weekly calls, as I'm sure we'll get into, Chris, like a year and a half of really checking in with each other and making sure that the campaign was progressing. And I think that's one of the key elements here is we were in the right environment, but that doesn't make it easy. It still requires a lot of work from everyone.
Yeah, and again, big shout out to Sue, who really was the manager of those meetings, who kept growing it and keeping people on track. And that became the template, OpenAir for every advocacy initiative we do, including other stuff we do in citizen science. It all revolves around the small group and the weekly meeting. That's the kind of the standard formula for us. And I think we learned an enormous amount for how to do that well in New Jersey. Before we kind of bring people into those meetings and who attended them and why they were so key, that was really helpful context, I think, Eric, because we see that in OpenAir too. There's just different, every state and place has its own, the table is set in a different way in terms of what are your hooks that you can really look at to try to make a policy work. And New Jersey has a lot of them. But interestingly, some people would look at New York and California and other states as maybe ones that you think that the table is even more set in a way that's more conducive for this policy. But yet here's New Jersey, the first one in the country that passed it, and it's absolutely the best low carbon procurement program for concrete in the country. Allison, I didn't know, just from your view, if you had anything else to add on the conditions in New Jersey that you think kind of created not exactly a straight path, but a path to getting this into law.
Yeah, thanks. And again, can't emphasize enough like how much everyone worked on this and the importance of that small group, kind of everyone making their calls, getting their intel. But something I would say that's important to remember is, Sue touched on it a little, that if at first you don't succeed, keep trying, that there might be another path forward, that if you have a group that's, opposed to a provision, talk to them, have dialogue, understand what they can live with, and bring that back to the sponsor. There was a lot of kind of that go between. The other thing that I think is really important for efforts like this is the messaging to your legislators. You don't end up with the same message for everybody, right? Because each legislator had a different take on it, or a different, concern. So like we said, we knew that Senator Greenstein really was a champion in this session. She sponsored it in the Senate, really pushed it through and worked with everyone. And as Eric said, she really cared about this legislation. There were other folks who cared more about the business angle, right? So we wanted to talk to them about the importance of being able to position New Jersey industry as a leader in this. We're between the New York and Philly markets. So we talked to them a lot about how giving those businesses an edge for something that we know is going to come as the demand increases, to kind of give New Jersey businesses a leg up. So for some folks who might not have been as interested for the emissions reduction reasons, they liked it for the business reasons. So you kind of have to tailor those conversations by knowing where your legislators are coming from. And, we were really proud that we had unanimous bipartisan support in the Senate, which does not always happen on environmental legislation. And I think it just really speaks to a lot of that messaging, right? And that outreach.
Absolutely. And I want to say something there that you brought up, is that I think at this stage right now in sort of political discourse in the United States, there's just such a focus in our democracy on elections, which can be silly and their lowest common denominator, and even sometimes sort of crass. And I think it kind of turns people off, and they think that that's the main event of politics, where the main event is really policy making and getting laws passed. And I think we had some amazing sponsors, and I was just so impressed by their staff, their ability to learn. These are people that have to deal with a huge portfolio of different issues. So I would encourage people to get involved in advocacy. It gives you a very different look at our legislators and our political leaders in terms of what they have to do and how they have to learn. But I thought we were really, really lucky with some amazing sponsors in both chambers. So let's get into the group that formed. And I'll give this as an opportunity, Sue, for you first to also really name those people in the Jersey group, because it was an awesome mix of people that were in different parts of the state. Most of them also didn't have an advocacy background, or maybe a limited one. And they played that really critical role in shaping and delivering and redelivering the message to their legislators under your direction. Can you tell us a little bit about who those folks were and the types of activities that were typically managed through the weekly group call, which was every Friday, I think at 10 o'clock or Eastern?
Yeah. Once we tried to do it during lunchtime. Some people took the call in their car and some people, you couldn't make it every week, and that's fine. But we had a core group of people. Really the key person was Sean Moen, who's head of the Tri-County Sustainability in South Jersey. Really great supporter, both through his organization and individually. And then we had Jeff Fedderson and Matt Parker, who are really involved in OpenAir, primarily on the tech side of doing the hands-on building of carbon removal devices, but have live in New Jersey or lived in New Jersey, and so had connections there. And then over time, we just got one or two people here or there through word of mouth. I mean, I posted on a Facebook group for New Jersey climate stuff. That's how I found Sean. And there was, I think, 350 New Jersey. Through them, we got Arun Nataraj, and he brought in Gautam Balde, who also had no, they were like from the pharmaceutical industry. They didn't have any advocacy background, but they were willing to reach out to their representatives. Maggie Ortiz, John Sanchez, people might recognize his name. And then, just like I said, the organizations that were in my little Chamber of Commerce group, they were really supportive and willing to contact their representatives and sign letters of support and so on. But it was just a handful of us, really. And we would just say, okay, who's going to contact this person? Or we have this spreadsheet of all of the assembly people who can go through the spreadsheet and pick off a couple names and give them a call or shoot them an email. And it was amazing that, I mean, I think people really wanted to hear from their constituents, but even reaching out to a random assembly person who we thought, maybe they voted for the environment, had a strong environmental record, they were willing to jump on as co-sponsors without a whole lot of time on our part and effort to try to get them on board. I think, we were really lucky that we got some traction, and even reaching out to organizations that we didn't necessarily have contacts with previously. Environmental organizations kind of were aware of the issue enough that they got interested and were willing to support it. So that's pretty much what our weekly started off being. And then it kind of evolved to having, we had the lobbyist from the paver bill involved, and he took a pretty big role just helping deal with the business, the industry and business concerns. And that was key to getting those folks on board. I mean, we had to do revisions, but that's how we got the bipartisan support, was because we got industry and business on board. And even, I think the primary group that we were concerned about were the contractors. The contractors, they didn't want to change the bidding process, but they were also concerned about taking on risk. Like if they bid for low carbon concrete and their bid was too low, who eats the cost? And we were able to come up, I didn't come up with it, but somehow in the conversations about this with Allison and Eric and Dave, the other lobbyists, they worked with the governor's office to kind of come up with a compromise that said, well, for the first 5 years, the state will take that risk, but after 5 years, the contractors will take on that risk. And it was a compromise that people were happy enough then to either support the bill, or the contractors ended up saying, we're just not going to oppose the bill, and we want you to know that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so the bipartisan aspect and the working to address the business and industry concerns were really key. And I give Senator Greenstein a lot of credit for being willing to have those tough conversations and being careful about how to bring the folks together so that it would be productive. Maybe Allison and Eric can speak more about that, but it really evolved. But it was great because our little group of open air people could see we got to see how the sausage was made, as they say. We went through the whole process twice. So
yeah, and I want to, before Allison and Eric weigh in, just sort of underscore a few points there. I mean, I think that the model at Open Air, it's really based around small, intimate groups, and occasionally other larger groups within our community coming in to do certain things. But we're not the model where the constituent volunteer is just someone who kind of sends an email along that is provided to them by staff. We're citizen lobbyists. And I think one of the things that was incredibly impressive is to watch your group, who had no background in concrete when we started, become the experts, to learn through the policymaking process, to actually write and adjust the policy and pivot, and then be someone who could walk into a room or go into a hearing and testify with confidence that you knew what you were talking about. So
that was really great experience, was to go in and testify. So
I
did that, and Arun did that. And
how many
when you have like a 2-minute window to say your bit, but it was eye-opening to see how that worked and how I could have a voice, or how our open air volunteers could really have a voice.
Yeah. And with Allison and Eric, I mean, I think one of the real opponents that we had in this was lack of knowledge about this very new subject area. And I think, Allison, you and both of you kind of spelled it out well, is that this was a novel area of policy. We started with this in New York. Nobody knew about it. We talked to legislators. We always joke that people confusing cement for concrete and all these things like that. So a big uphill part of this was just making sure people understood what we were talking about, what we weren't talking about. And I wonder if you can, all three of you, maybe we can start with Allison and Eric, can kind of summarize for us, like, where were the sort of the gaps in knowledge? And I think if we can also particularly talk about the environmental community, because we had some resistance from certain groups within the environmental community that I think there was concerns that there was confusion about what the bill was doing. So could you guys talk about what the main things that we had to sort of shine some light on in order to get people to come along with us? Maybe we'll start with you, Allison, if you want to.
Yeah, I can jump in, and then Eric, feel free. One of the things that Sue kind of alluded to is I definitely through this process learned a lot more about local public contracts law than I ever thought I would. It's because part of this is when you have a great idea, right? And you put it on paper and you draft it into a bill. Then you have to start to go through the process and figure out how everyone's going to react. Maybe there are stakeholders or people who will be affected that you didn't even know about. And so that's how we kind of kept amending, kept changing, kept moving forward to try to kind of get everybody to neutral. I see somebody put in the chat that not going to oppose sometimes is a huge win. I agree. But so the contracting issue, as Sue mentioned, it had to do with, at the end of the day, that this is a newer technology, right? And we know that technologies are still developing. So folks were concerned because of the way that public contracts work, that they were, if people didn't bid a reasonable amount, they were going to be left holding the bag for the difference on state projects. And for some large scale projects, that can be a pretty significant number. And so that was kind of one of the first areas of compromise. One of the other things that we did really early is to try to educate people even on why this matters, like how much of an impact this could really have. So, we put together our little one-pager that we could give out to legislators and just let people know things like, if concrete were a country, it would be the third largest emitter. Those kind of facts really catch people's attention, because otherwise, concrete, you don't think ever you could get people that excited about it, but we really did. And I think, Chris, you said it at the beginning too, some of those other stats that, we tell people it's the second most commonly used substance after water. When you say things like that, when you just start to even put context on it and frame it for advocates and for legislators, it really helps kind of emphasize the need for legislation like this. And the other thing is, I would say it's really important to listen to all the different groups that are. I'd be happy to direct everyone to that one pager. So yes, I'll share that. But the other thing I just wanted to say is it is really important to listen to those concerns, because it's really easy when you have a great idea to just kind of want to try to push it forward. But when you end up with other folks who are active in the political space who are opposed, that can kind of kill a whole bill, right? Because they can have their own conversations and say, well, we don't like this. And then all of a sudden you're like, why isn't my bill getting posted? So it's really important to talk to those groups and understand what their concerns are and to come up with solutions collaboratively. That's really the only way that we moved it forward.
Yeah, I think this group did that incredibly well. And it's the really important line to stick to being intellectually honest and fact-based. So when we talk about different messaging for different groups, it's never a matter of obscuring what the actual bill does or selling something that's not accurate. It's about really just more a matter of emphasis, I think, to kind of make it resonate with different groups. Let me just do something real quick. I see Rob Niven, I'm so glad has joined. Rob is the founder and CEO of Carbon Cure, which was actively involved, plays an amazing role with policy in addition to their core business, to try to move things forward. And Rob and I connected probably 3 years ago on this initially, and we were very, very involved. And Rob did point out that there was a precedent in Hawaii, which then was adopted by the Congress of Mayors, that wasn't a law, but it was a resolution of support of using carbon mineralized concrete, considering it for their business. And that was an important little rough edge that we were able to kind of point to, as well as a few other places like bi-partisan California, which has some overlap, and some things in Europe. But Rob is correct. Rob, if I could also ask you had some breaking news last week. Please do put the link of the really exciting demonstration that you did that is the first, I think, to take carbon out of the air from direct air capture and mineralize it in concrete. I know that Carbon Cure was behind that this week, so please do put the link to that in there. I'm not sure if it's the same, Rob, but let me just quickly, some great questions that are being asked here. I'm just going to go through those real quickly. One is, does OpenAir only focus on solutions that remove carbon, or do we also look at reduced carbon footprint? Our main interest is carbon removal, but in this policy, we realized that there was a real vacuum around just lowering carbon, and we didn't want to put a policy forward that was just narrowly focused on promoting carbon utilization in concrete. We needed to address a much larger question of how do we decarbonize it, period. So we're very pragmatic when it comes to that. So this policy has nested within it an incentive for carbon utilization from the air or industrial sources, but it addresses much more broadly decarbonization. Can anyone speak to existing efforts directed toward a federal DOT adoption? That's another part of this story, mostly through New York. There was familiarity with the LECCLA bill in New York that made its way into conversations around the IRA and Infrastructure Act. And there's parts of the IRA about incentivizing high performance that has already been budgeted. The rules haven't been defined for it yet. That really, we have a good reason to believe really traces back actually to the work in New York and New Jersey. So it's not only influencing other states, but the Fed. Can LECCLA policies be adopted through rules rather than legislation? Absolutely. We think it really can. It really depends on what the fiscal impact of it is. But there might be certain states that already have discretionary pots of money that can be used for this, or that can be sought. So we actually are in different places pursuing direct executive approaches in some places. So it doesn't necessarily require legislation, all of its pieces. Some of it can be done federally. And then there's how will the target GHG be assigned for the various mixes used? Okay, that one I'm just going to skip over. That's a complicated subject and we have 10 minutes left, but that making sure that we come up with, it's a complicated material. So how do we come up with ways of assigning that threshold across different forms of concrete mixes is definitely going to require some work, but there's already that work in motion in other places, as well as through the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I'm going to answer the rest of the questions, but I just wanted to pause and make sure that we got those as well. So let's go back. I don't know if Eric or Sue had anything to add to that last point about knowledge raising, because it is a key part of the story.
Yeah, I do. So even in the recent press, like Bloomberg's done a couple of articles about this now. They got some comments back from an environmentalist who was concerned that, the bill wasn't based on science and that there are pollution issues and so on. And that's something, I didn't know what issues were being raised. And when I found out, I'm like, oh, okay, those are easy issues that we heard about a long time ago with the New York bill. But just educating environmentalists that, this is science-based. There are these EPD standards and life cycle analysis involved. And these are real, emissions numbers that we're looking at trying to lower. But also, there are ongoing environmental issues around cement plants and they're polluting and, concerns that by trying to push cement to be lower emissions, that they're going to dirtier alternative fuels like waste, solid waste burning. And that's a totally different can of worms. Like this bill it's not preventing anyone from putting pollution regulations in place to address that. And in New Jersey in particular doesn't have any cement plants. So we had no, we didn't have those activists involved in New York to have to educate them. But, like when the Bloomberg person, Stephen Lee said, I got these complaints, I was able to explain to him, well, here's why those complaints aren't really issues. And he was like, oh, okay, yeah, so it sounds like there's nothing here. So it's really a matter of just explaining and being upfront about it and saying, we really did do our homework here. And, this is a solid bill, and we're able to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we only have time is flying by. There's a lot we could talk to, and I do want to cover the remaining questions because they're all excellent ones. But one point that I really wanted to stress again that you kind of just said is like having the knowledge development within our members so that they can speak in a distributed way when needed to journalists or legislators, I think is a really key part of the success. Ali asked a really, really good question. I think one of the things that we're incredibly proud about and that we think the world is now watching. This is now a law in New Jersey. And so we want to spread it all over the place. And so I'm making a direct pitch. If anybody, I'll put my email in. If anybody is in any state where you are and you want to pull a Sue and just move forward with a group of people, we're here to support you, including Sue. But there's the bipartisan support for this was like breathtaking. I think it's so countered the way that we normally think about these issues. And I wonder if we can just take a moment to reflect on how remarkable that is. And Ali asked, like, how do we speak to different, parties? I think we've covered that a little bit. But can you kind of try to give us a sense, Allison and Eric, we'll start with Eric, about that doesn't happen every day. Like, give us the numbers on how broadly it passed, but like, why was that? Like, how was that achieved?
I think one of the big things that influenced that It's definitely what Allison was touching on at the end of her comments, which is how compromise was reached between different parties. I think we benefited from this being a novel policy area. So a lot of it was education. People didn't already have positions like staked out in the ground as institutions. And B, I think having citizen advocates, I'll just speak for myself on this, forced us all to engage a little more honestly with what might be, considered opposition. I think that, doing this day in and day out, there's certain policies where you can kind of anticipate who's going to oppose or who's going to support a certain policy priority. And sometimes it puts you on a war footing, maybe faster than you want to be on one, to just kind of win, right? You can't science your way out of it. There's just going to be opposing sides. Because this was an educational campaign at its core between folks who had concerns or were initially opposed, it led to a lot more good faith conversations where we tried to find out what was the concern, how can we address the concern. And because of that, ultimately groups got into a position where they felt comfortable, or at least, I think, as the comment mentioned, did not oppose, which is a big win in and of itself. And at the end of the day, everyone felt like they learned something. They felt like they weren't going to be harmed. They felt like they were getting something out of it. And I think that's because we started from a place of good faith and education rather than trying to win with the initial policy, which was really important here.
Yeah, so true. And what were the numbers again? What was it unanimous in the Senate? I can't remember. It was
unanimous bipartisan in the Senate, and then very close in the Assembly. Not quite 100%, but close.
There were only 4 opposing votes in the Assembly, and I think 74 in favor.
Yeah, for anyone that's not familiar with New Jersey, we have 40 voting districts. So there's 40 senators and 80 Assembly people.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of it was the design of it was it's market based. It creates an incentive that really kind of puts a real direct interest for concrete companies that, again, that operate. A lot of them are small businesses. They operate on razor thin margins. Another way to earn revenue that is a win for the environment. And I think that the policy structure, as well as the way that we communicated it, really explain that pretty extraordinary number that I've been in 20 years in this world. I've never seen anything quite like it. So just a couple other things I wanted to raise. Eric Dunford, who is absolutely an active part in this, amazing expertise. What are we seeing right now in terms of industry participation? I think a lot of the providers like the Carbon Cures and Carbon Belts and Carbocrete, and there's so many of them now, different companies that offer low carbon alternatives. They're going to have something to add to their sort of sales to their concrete companies to participate. We don't know who's most interested in it now, but it'll be incredibly interesting to see, how the education about making sure that it's well known to providers that they have this incentive is a really, really big part of it. So it just doesn't get implemented in silence. So it will be very interesting to see that. And then Zahra asks the New York question. And I think this is a broader point that we can make here is about, New York, New Jersey, right next to each other. Sometimes they get with Connecticut sort of slammed together as though it's one place. They're not. There's very different background conditions. And where we are in New York right now is we passed the bill that sort of forced the state to create a stakeholder panel to review the policies that were proposed. And then hopefully they get implemented through that. And that's beginning right now. I'm fortunate to be representing NRDC on that panel in New York. So we're hoping to see, can we get these things implemented in New York as well? And that job becomes a lot easier when New Jersey literally just passed it last week. So we're no longer talking about a whiteboard. We're talking about something that is now a law. And so that really kind of puts a lot of momentum. So we'll keep you posted on that one. But New York is a lot different. We have 2 cement plants and activists focused around cement plants in New York that were sort of real keys to kind of pushing back on the bill, a lot of it because of misunderstandings that we just didn't have in New Jersey. So it was a different set of characters, I guess, that were both for and against in New York as opposed to next door in New Jersey. But we are very optimistic that we're going to get some good policy done in New York in the next 2 quarters. So I think that covers most. There's a question about why are we not doing this federally? I did say that I think it kind of is happening federally. I was also talking to some federal legislators yesterday about, is there a legislative need to try to get this done at the federal level? But there's scope for doing it based on what's already happened with the Inflation Reduction Act about trying to get a policy that's structured like that with money that's already been assigned. So we think that the federal impact is already starting to happen. Dick Smith, who asked that question. I see you're in Wisconsin. We've already had conversations with people in Wisconsin about LECCLA Wisconsin, and an amazing activist, Julie, led by who is a superstar in lower carbon. She heads a Girl Scout group, which is just this exceptional messengers around low carbon concrete. So I did put my email there if you are interested in finding out more about that or participating in it. Let's see what we can do in Wisconsin in 2023. So I know we're at time. We do have a couple of minutes here, and I want to just quickly, if I can, just go to each one of you and very concisely, if you can say, what is the most important thing that you think that led to this result happening in New Jersey? If you can just each kind of offer that. I'll start with Sue, and then I'll go to Allison and Eric.
That's tough. I mean, there are a couple of things, but I really feel like we were so fortunate to get Senator Greenstein on board with this bill, and she just picked it up. She was interested from the beginning. We didn't even approach her. She picked it up, and she fought for it. And she had standards. She wasn't going to do certain things. She wanted to have the hard conversations and make sure that everybody was going to have their needs met. And that was a tough process, and it took a long time to get an answer figured out, but she was committed, and she wasn't going to rush it and try to push something through that wasn't good enough, ultimately. So patience in Senator Greenstein, I would say.
Patience is a huge one. Oh my God, patience. You have to have this is a marathon, not a sprint, not to use a cliche. But Allison, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Senator Greenstein, for sure, a huge champion. I would also, and Assemblyman McKeon in the Assembly, I would also just say collaboration, because whether it was with legislators, with groups who originally were proposed, with each other, keeping that dialogue open, collaboration and communication really got this bill over the line.
Absolutely. And Eric?
I will agree with everything that was said, but also highlight Sue herself. I think without her involvement in tirelessly pushing this, there's a lot of moments in time where we could have lost steam or paused. And we didn't, and we kept moving, and it got done. So thank you, Sue.
Yeah, and I want to say that, and I am such a softie. I hope I don't tear up even saying this, but when we started OpenAir, the hypothesis was that people like Sue would show up and contribute. And you're the best, Sue, what you've pulled off. So people have asked, is this being recorded? It has been recorded. I will send it out to everybody who RSVP'd. It will also go onto our website. So please share it around. And again, we are an action network. This is not an academic exercise, as you can tell. Please do reach out. We will support you. There's an amazing community within OpenAir. You got amazing groups like NRDC, the League, and others and we're ready to really spread this around. So please do be in touch. And with that, I will go ahead and conclude the webinar, but want to thank you all for the amazing work you've done and for sharing your experiences today. Okay?
Thank you all. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.